We begin with a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has seen incessant bombings, aerial dogfights, and street battles in various parts of the country. The local council says Russian forces who've surrounded the port city have reduced it to ashes. Kyiv is calling on Moscow to allow civilians to escape Mariupol. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says 100,000 people are trapped without food, water, or medication. Zelenskyy also says Russian troops have seized a humanitarian convoy attempting to bring relief to Mariupol's residents.
These are missiles fired by Russia from sea and from land against Ukraine. These images were released by Russia's defense ministry. As were these, in which Russia claims to have hit a Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile system. But shells aren't only falling on military targets. In Kyiv, this home was hit by a Russian strike. Firefighters worked to put out the blaze that followed. It was a strike on the roof. I walked out of the house to smoke a cigarette, and when I went back inside, it happened. The ceiling collapsed. In Mariupol, the city under siege hit relentlessly by Russian bombing, satellite images show the extent of the devastation. Life is hell for people who are still stuck in the city. Russia has used more than 1,000 missiles against peaceful Ukrainian cities. Countless numbers of aerial bombs. Russian troops have destroyed dozens of our cities. Some have been burned to ashes. In many cities and villages under Russian occupation, our people can't even bury their dead relatives with dignity. These buses are headed close to Mariupol. They're intended to collect people who managed to flee the besieged city and take them to safety.
For more, let's speak to Maria Tomak in Lviv. She's head of the Crimea Platform Department at the mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea. Maria, thank you for taking the time to speak to DW now. You've been working for years to document Russia's human rights abuses in annexed Crimea. How has your work changed since Russia launched this full-scale invasion last month?
Hello. Basically, indeed, it's important to say that this war actually has started not on February 24 of the current year, but much earlier in the year 2014, when Russian Federation invaded Crimea and occupied the Crimean Peninsula. And since then, and after Russia invaded Donbass, as we all know. So since then, Ukrainian human rights community has been documenting the human rights violations and war crimes in those areas, although it wasn't easy because it all happened mostly without the direct access to those territories. So we've been using various tools in order to get the information from there. But now I would say that in terms of working with Crimea, the situation changed in the way that even those sources that we used inside the peninsula, those people who talked to us, who communicated with us, who spoke openly about human rights abuses, now, they behave more carefully, because we all understand that these people are already hostages because they're on the occupied territories. And now it's even more complicated since Russia also changed its legislation after this new all-out war was launched and started. So now when you say that Russia wages war against Ukraine, it may be qualified as an offense in a good, so to say, in the better case, it may be qualified as an administrative offense, in worst case as a criminal offense, but nevertheless, it will be perceived like a so-called discreditation of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. So therefore, and we have plenty of cases like this in Crimea already. There are such cases also in Russia as well. So when people just say that, okay, Russia went to a war, in a large-scale war against Ukraine, and after that they were fined by the court.
Now, I do want to ask you, after this full-scale invasion, again, as you said, the war started for Ukrainians 8 years ago, but this full-scale invasion started 4 weeks ago. Is your team also looking at abuses happening in other parts of the country now as well? And how difficult has that been, given this incessant Russian bombing in some of these places?
Actually, our team is, I would say, it's very different in terms of that. Now we have various people involved in the process of the documentation. Basically, the governmental institutions that I represent now. Just a few months ago, I was with the human rights sector, but recently I shifted to the governmental position. But nevertheless, civil society organizations, human rights organizations, jointly with governmental institutions, try to collect as many information as it's possible in order to get the evidences, the testimonies, the facts, the open sources information about those abuses that are taking place. And of course, it's incomparable in terms of the scales of those violations, even to the years prior to that. Because when it comes to Crimea, there was no actually like a full-fledged war there. I mean, with the armings, all of those awful things that we see now, it was, I would say, silently occupied and seized by the Russian Federation, unlike Donbass. But nevertheless, even in Donbass, although there was a war over there for years, it wasn't so brutal as it's now, for instance, in Mariupol, that was just described in your program.
Maria, you're documenting these war crimes. You're seeing the images on television on what's happening in the rest of your country. When you look to the future now, do you see one where a Vladimir Putin or a senior Russian official could one day, face prosecution for launching this invasion of your country?
Yes, definitely. And I think that it's one of the most important debates that are taking place now within Ukraine, but also with various legal experts around the globe, is how actually it's possible to bring to responsibility Russian officials. And the most obvious answer would be the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which has already intensified its efforts for the investigation of the developments in Ukraine since 2014, basically, not starting from now, but even prior to that. But another idea which seems to me very important is the tribunal, the separate tribunal over Vladimir Putin regime somewhere in Kharkiv, for instance, who was the city suffered a lot also from the Russian invasion and Russian occupation as of now. But what I would like to underline, because it's somehow interlinked with those debates that I can follow within the German media and maybe public discussions, is whether it's only about Vladimir Putin or not. I think that we have to be very clear and have to be very, we have to be honest with ourselves that lots of people in Russian Federation do support this war. And it's a huge challenge, and it's a huge question of humanitarian kind, is what to do, how to work with the Russian population in order to, demilitarize the mind of those people who explicitly support this aggression against Ukraine. So Vladimir Putin is not unfortunately, the only person who stands behind that. I'm afraid that's the reality.
Maria Tomak with the Crimea platform at the mission of the President of Ukraine. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Here's a look at some of the other developments in the conflict. A top Kremlin aide has become the first member of Putin's inner circle to quit his post over Russia's war on Ukraine. Anatoly Chubais was Putin's special representative for ties with international organizations, but is better known as the architect of Russia's post-Soviet economic reforms. He has reportedly left the country. Poland has expelled 45 Russian diplomats, calling them Kremlin spies. A government spokesperson said it was part of Warsaw's dismantling of the Russian special services network in the country. They've given most of the group 5 days to leave Poland. Moscow has called the accusations absurd. Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country will start charging what he calls unfriendly countries in rubles for the gas they buy. Putin says a freeze on Russia's assets by foreign nations had destroyed Moscow's trust in, quote, compromised currencies like the dollar and the euro. Pope Francis has made a fresh appeal for peace in Ukraine. He paid tribute to the victims of the war and said buying and producing more weapons is not the solution to the problem. He urged both Ukraine and Russia to work together for peace. U.S. President Joe Biden is heading to Brussels to meet with NATO leaders at an emergency summit on Ukraine. The alliance is trying to balance further military assistance for Ukraine while avoiding a direct confrontation with Moscow. NATO has promised more support to help Ukraine protect itself from chemical warfare. But the alliance is also taking precautions outside the country, deploying soldiers and weapons in Eastern European member states. More reinforcements are on the way. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the alliance will send more troops to Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Slovakia, and will double its number of battle groups stationed near Russia. Stoltenberg has implored member states to invest more resources in order to stop the war from escalating.
The decisions we take tomorrow will have far-reaching implications. Major reinforcements to our security will require major investments in defense. So I expect allies will agree to redouble their efforts to invest more. There is a new sense of urgency because we cannot take peace for granted.
Earlier, we spoke to our NATO correspondent in Brussels, Terry Schultz. She told us more about what to expect from the summit.
The most important point for tomorrow's summit is to demonstrate that all 30 allies, Europe and the United States, are completely on the same page when it comes to being willing to commit whatever it takes to defend alliance territory against any potential spillover from the war on Ukraine. And that's a message they want to send both to the Kremlin and also to Eastern allies who are nervous about the potential effect that the war will have on them and that possibly Russian President Vladimir Putin will set his sights on them next. So all of these reinforcements are going to be very welcome in those capitals. They will also be joined at one point by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. And he, of course, will be asking Leila for things he's not going to get, like a no-fly zone, like these fighter jets that may or may not at one point be on their way to Ukraine. But he is expected to hear from allies that they'll be sending more defensive equipment, and he'll get more moral support, even though none of these allies are, of course, willing to send forces to serve on the ground in Ukraine.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has addressed lawmakers in France. It's the latest in a series of speeches he's given before parliaments of allied countries. The Ukrainian leader called for a minute of silence for Ukraine and for victims of the war. He also told French lawmakers that they have many of the answers into this war in their hands, sending more weapons, withdrawing French companies from Russia, and imposing stronger sanctions.
We need help, even more help and support. For freedom not to lose, it should be well armed. Tanks, anti-tanks, fighter jets, aerial defense. You can help us, and we need it. For freedom not to lose, the world should support it with sanctions against the aggressor. Each week, a new sanctions package. French companies should leave the Russian market. Renault, Auchan, Leroy Merlin and others. They should stop being the sponsors of Russia's war machine.
Earlier, we spoke to our correspondent Lisa Lewis in Paris. We asked her whether France can deliver what President Zelenskyy is asking for.
Well, what's certain is that France is very determined to stand by Ukraine's side. France has been sending weapons. They've been sending humanitarian support. They also have been freezing the assets of the Russian central bank here in France, and the government is determined to continue to do so. When it comes to sanctions, that's something the Elysee told reporters today that France was talking about with European international partners. That will also be a point of discussion later on in Brussels during meetings with the EU, with NATO. But obviously they are talking about that. They are working on that. What's for sure is that the French President Emmanuel Macron has been taking on a very prominent role when it comes to talks between Ukraine, between Russia. He's been in constant touch with the Ukrainian president and talked to Vladimir Putin yesterday. Obviously, for now, this has not really yielded the results everybody was hoping for. That is a ceasefire and formal negotiations between Russia and Ukraine.